it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Benjamin Alderson-Day, who is Professor of Psychology and the Research Group Lead in the Development Science at Durham. And he's going to talk to us about what is this thing called presence.
Thank you very much, Boyd, and thank you to everybody who are here on a late Friday afternoon at the end of the conference. It was a real pleasure to be invited to BNPO. I've been admired it from afar for a while, and the quality of the science and the research that's being done here. And so clearly I thought, oh my God, I need to turn up with lots of academic research and statistics in the slides to back up the claims I'm going to make. But actually, there's only a few of those in there, along with some stories, because somehow I've got to follow Adam's brilliant overview of the imagination as well. Today I'm going to be talking about something called presence, specifically felt presence, that's arisen, a line of research for me that's arisen from work at Durham University, and the topic of a book that I published a couple of years ago. To offer you a bit of context, I was part of a team who worked for 10 years at Durham on a Wellcome Trust-funded project called Hearing the Voice. It was an interdisciplinary investigation of what it's like to hear voices that other people cannot hear, also known as auditory verbal hallucinations. And the aim of taking an interdisciplinary approach was to see in what other ways we could think about this often kind of stigmatized and misunderstood phenomenon. Obviously, something that people would usually associate with schizophrenia and psychosis, but also an experience which has been understood in many different ways across cultures, across historical eras, and can occur inside and outside of the context of illness. One thing that we did as part of our interdisciplinary team was that we invited people with lived experience into that space to talk to us about their experiences, something which now many health projects, health research quite rightly would expect to happen as per normal, but wasn't always necessarily the case, say, 10 or 15 years ago. And we talked to them about their experiences from all these different kind of perspectives and frameworks. And one thing that kind of crept in quite early on, kept coming up, was this suggestion that asking just about voices was slightly missing the point. And by that, they didn't mean you need to think about other senses too, and it is indeed the case within psychosis and schizophrenia research that often we just talk about auditory hallucinations. When we talk about hallucinations, we don't talk so much about visions, we don't talk about touch, we don't talk about taste. But they meant something more than that, and in particular, I remember there was one young man who was talking to us who said, you know, sometimes you don't even have to hear them. Sometimes you just know they're there. And that emphasis, that sense of them just being there, was something that didn't really fit with any of the major theories of how we understood hallucination in the context of psychosis, which primarily still at that point focused on how would it be possible to hallucinate the senses. It was mostly embedded in kind of influential work of people like Chris Frith in the cognitive neuropsychiatry of schizophrenia, whereby we would hallucinate these things via some sort of misattribution process, a disruption to our sensory motor processing where our usual expectations about the world are not met. Latterly, that morphed into more kind of predictive coding, predictive processing ideas, but nevertheless, it was still about sensory content somehow being placed out there in the world or misattributed. There wasn't anything about a kind of more basic feeling of something being there. And that was the puzzle that struck me. How do we understand that sort of experience in the context of psychosis? Now, feeling that something's there is an idea that goes back to the kind of the roots and the beginning of psychology as a discipline. William James wrote about it in the Varieties of Religious Experience following his Gifford Lectures in Edinburgh in 1902. He referred to it as a perception of what we may call something there more deep and more general than any of the special and particular senses. Now, more latterly, particularly in neurology, we talk about a sensed presence or a felt presence being a sensation that somebody distinct from oneself is present nearby, when no one is actually there in the absence of sensory clues revealing a presence. And Gilles Fenelon, the French neurologist, has done lots of amazing work on this in relation to Parkinson's. Now, that sense of someone else being there separate from us is distinguished from some of the other ways in which presence get used in adjacent fields. So, for example, anybody who works in VR may have heard of the term presence, which refers to your feeling that you're present, actually present in the virtual environment. Sometimes within phenomenological psychopathology, people talk about a sense of presence, and that's one's sense of oneself being in reality, okay, that you are actually there. But in this context, what we're talking about is the sense of the other, seemingly in the absence of sensory clues. Now, it can happen in that pure way. Sometimes people say, I just don't know how I feel it, I just feel it. In reality, what you tend to see is something a little bit blurrier, where people refer to kind of sensory or quasi-sensory content almost around the edges. So maybe something about the glimpse of your eye, or the kind of the starting of a story about presence, which maybe had an element of a voice in there. And for that reason, in a review that we published in Lancet Psychiatry in 2023, led by Joan Barmby, we referred to the absence of clear sensory evidence, because in the wild, these sorts of experiences tend to be a little bit muddier. Nevertheless, you do sometimes get these seemingly kind of contentless experiences of felt presence. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about over the next half an hour, I'm going to talk about three main areas in relation to felt presence. A bit more on psychosis and schizophrenia, then what we can learn from examples from survival and endurance contexts, and finally presences in the context of sleep paralysis and hypnagogia. Now, as with many things, when you go back through the history of psychosis research and go back to some of the original case descriptions and phenomenology, you find they're very rich and much richer than maybe, let's say, reforms in the APA since kind of 1970 really do justice to. So if you turn to Jaspers talks about this experience. He called it a leibhaftige Bewusstheit, a bodily awareness, the feeling that someone was inside of me and then stepped out, perhaps out to the side, or somehow I felt as if someone constantly walked by my side. So this is an indicative example from a case of somebody having this experience of presence, this feeling of some other kind of body with a very specific spatial location, somehow kind of linked to you, perhaps alongside you, very close by. Jaspers was keen to distinguish this from a gedankliche Bewusstheit, an ideational awareness, like that kind of vague knowing that somebody might be nearby, and really focused in on this kind of strange, eerie bodily feeling. Now, actually, those sorts of descriptions didn't really get picked up that much when you go then through the 20th century, looking at, how do we understand that in the context of psychotic experiences. One person who did pick up on this was MacDonald Critchley, who worked for many years at Queen Square, not far from here. Many of you will have heard of Critchley's work. For those of you who don't, Critchley was almost a kind of Oliver Sacks type before Oliver Sacks existed. He wrote about a whole range of very rich cases from neuropsychology, psychiatry, neurology, publishing books called things like The Divine Banquet of the Brain, which you just don't really get books with those titles anymore. But a really fantastic writer, a really kind of wide-ranging thinker. And he had a paper in 1955 called The Idea of a Presence, where he was one of the first people who started to connect dots together. He went, hang on, these sorts of experiences got described in early descriptions of psychosis, but they also occur in epilepsy, and they also occur in shipwrecks, in survival situations. In this, Critchley was particularly shaped by his experiences working in the Navy in World War II and coming across many people who, in very adverse circumstances, would start to have these experiences. And one thing Critchley noted as well was that presences are quite hard for people to talk about. They often kind of run up at the limits of their language or vocabulary when they try to explain what this experience is. We don't really know what to say other than something's there in a kind of very, very basic sense. And he said that has implications for things like clinical assessment. The patient may be reluctant to volunteer the information. The neurologist, in his ignorance, may neglect to inquire for it or to record it if mentioned. Consequently, we are apt to regard it as a rare phenomenon, though perhaps unjustifiably so. Scooting forward then to only a few years ago, this is a more detailed example of some data we collected from a phenomenological study we ran as part of Hearing the Voice. It was a part of a 3-year study called Voices in Psychosis, where we wanted to explore in depth the experience of hearing voices for people using early intervention and psychosis services for the first time. And we were interested in lots of the things that usually kind of get underexplored, perhaps aspects of, say, personification of voices, one's relationship to voices, the kinds of things now that people are drawing upon when they're using techniques like avatar therapy. But again, traditionally, we haven't been explored so much in the literature. And we didn't ask directly about presence, but we did talk about it if people brought it into the room with us. What we didn't want to do is just say, does it feel like the voices are really present, or does it feel like these things are really present? Because there's a worry that people will just say yes, in a way that what they're answering when they answer that question is, does it feel like it's real? For somebody with psychosis, often if they hear a voice and it really feels like a real voice, they're going to say, yeah, I'm not imagining it, it's like a real voice. So similarly with just asking directly about presence, you have to be really careful. And within this phenomenological interview, one that was designed by our whole team, we tried to come at it more indirectly, and we ended up with some very rich descriptions, although often only on the second or third time that we would talk to people. This is a fairly representative example, a young man with the pseudonym Will, who talks about his experiences. He talks about sensing that they're there, the presence of them's there. It's like, when you walk into a situation and you get that instant shiver not a nice shiver, not the kind of shivers that Adam was talking about, a really kind of insidious shiver. You get the hairs going up in your arm, that goosebumpy feeling. It's like as if someone, you get that feeling like someone's walked over your grave. That feeling through your body. That's the best way to describe it. So we're talking about a very embodied and visceral experience there. And this person's doing a really good job of trying to explain what it feels like. And yet it's something still that's quite kind of hard to kind of capture, something ephemeral going on there. Now, we found that quite a few people in our sample would describe this experience as, in fact, over half, 52% of the sample in this study described these sorts of experiences. We developed a big phenomenological coding frame that featured over 60 different codes, and we also had some kind of standardized assessments in there, so things like the CIRATS, the Psychotic Symptoms Rating Scale. And via that, we could do things like explore, well, what other kind of aspects of phenomenology seem to associate with the feeling of presence. One thing was other tactile experiences, tactile hallucinations. So what I don't mean here is that people, when they have presence, would have touch as well. There'd be a worry if that was the case, because you perhaps feel like, well, they feel like there's a presence because they're being touched. Rather, this is that people are having presences and they're separately having touch experiences. Fear was a very strong emotion associated with these experiences, as we might expect. Being directly addressed by voices that really feel like they're speaking directly to you, perhaps even issuing commands. This was associated with presence. And a slight gender imbalance as well, in that women rather than men seem to be reporting these experiences. We also were able to take the CIRATS data from baseline and look at what are the main differences between people who do and don't report presences. Is there any sense in which this is associated more with a general propensity to hallucinations rather than delusions or not? And what we found, you can see in particular on the left-hand graph here, is that people who tended to score higher for hallucinations on the CIRATS, and here we're talking about auditory hallucinations, they tended to also have felt presence, whereas there was no difference really in delusion scores between those who had presence or not. When you drill down into the subscales that you have in the CIRATS, we could also show that rather than what are termed the kind of physical qualities of hallucinations, so things like location, frequency, and rather than the cognitive aspects, which are more to do with like attentional control and impact, it was the emotional aspects of hallucinations that were really heightened in these people who experienced presence. So we're talking about quite an intense experience. Now, some caveats from that study, quite a small study, because we're doing kind of in-depth work. There's also a study which involved people talking about those experiences a lot. And we tended to see people about 3 or 4 months into using EIP, where certain things are kind of stabilized. They didn't tend to be really, really paranoid or kind of strongly delusional. Things had kind of settled down more at this stage. But they did have lots of hallucinations, lots of voices. And that probably led to a certain amount of kind of selection bias in terms of who could take part in the study. So we wanted to know a bit more about, well, what is it like in larger samples with a kind of more kind of evident pattern of delusions? And in a separate study that we ran in similar services, different population though, we could look at some of those baseline characteristics. This was a study done as part of the Managing Unusual Sensory Experiences feasibility study. It's a CBT intervention, where Rob Dudley, who is a ClinPsych based in Newcastle, now at York, who led on this study, adapted the CIRATS to cover lots of different modalities and to ask about presence. And the key headlines we got from that study was that we actually found almost 66% of participants reported feelings of presence. However, there was often this kind of overlap with aspects of paranoia as well. And this occurred either serially, so sometimes people having presences and then other modalities, and sometimes in a kind of multimodal way where presence was feeling like it was happening at the same time as other senses. Now, we know this compares quite well with another sample too. So we have data now from Emmanuel Peters' STAR trial, which is just finished baseline. This is a study running out of King's College, primarily looking at psychosis and PTSD, using exactly the same measures, this adapted CIRATS as Rob's. And there they have a prevalence rate for presence around 63%. But the way they're asking about these things is a lot more direct. It's not that kind of exploratory phenomenological mode. And that means also that it seems to be much more associated with delusions so far in these samples. I should highlight too that rates of paranoia and delusions in these groups are higher too. So right now, we're going to go and test what the association is in the STAR sample too, but right now it seems like there's evidence of both heightened rates of hallucination severity and delusions in these groups. And Another thing we've done more recently is explore something around that gender difference, and for that we use data from a very large study run out of Iris Sommer's team at Groningen, where they ran a survey of about 10,000 people in Holland looking at general hallucinatory experiences using the QPE, which is a measure which was devised specifically to be able to measure comparable non-clinical and clinical experiences. And what we did from that is look at, well, what are the rates of people talking about felt presence? There's kind of sections in the QPE where you can spontaneously describe your experiences. And for the people who report presence, how they're different from other people. And what we found in that was that, again, women were more likely to report this experience than men. We noticed some associations with visual and tactile hallucination-like experiences, delusion-like thinking in the general population too, and associations with exposure to life adversity, poor sleep, and loneliness as well. Now, some of these things are things we'd expect anyway for hallucination proneness, but they fit quite well with some of the things we're thinking about, why this presence occur. Is it something about kind of sociality? Is it something about sleep as well? And in particular, we're interested in that replication of the gender difference. So what do we need to know next in this particular area? Well, one thing is, how important is the hallucination-delusion distinction? Because we could think about it as a kind of important theoretical or philosophical distinction, but actually in clinical reality, maybe what's important is that you've got lots of these things going on, and presence is a real marker that it's really difficult. Another way of thinking about it is, what role does presence play in relation to some of these other experiences? One thought is it could be an inference. You're having lots of weird experiences of like invisible voices and strange visions. Therefore, somehow you come to expect this almost as a kind of conscious or non-conscious inference. Another possibility is it's just an additional symptom. Now, noting the percentages I've mentioned already, these are higher than rates of tactile or gustatory hallucinations that we usually expect. And it's not every day that we pick out, say, a new aspect of psychotic phenomena, and it seems to be relatively prevalent. But finally, one thought is that it could be at the bedrock of a number of these experiences. And some of that thinking comes from people like Vaughan Bell and Sam Wilkinson's work a few years back, thinking about kind of the social, cognitive aspects of psychosis. But also work from grassroots groups and user-led groups like Rethink Psychosis. This was a group set up by Shannon Pagden and Nev Jones, both of whom have lived experience of psychosis, who are researchers themselves. And they produced this report based on accounts of people who lived experience of psychosis called Psychosis Outside the Box in 2021. And I won't read this whole quote that's here, but one thing that quite a few people mentioned was, look, clinicians talk about hallucinations or delusions, but for us, underneath it all is presence, this feeling that you've got these kind of invisible entities that this particular person refers to as part of a kind of ephemeral reality. So potentially we're talking about something here which is really quite fundamental to lots of these experiences. But to come back to some of that kind of hallucination-delusion distinction, one question is, what's the mechanism? Because it's still quite unclear, well, if it is a hallucination, what's the perceptual content? What's the sensory content of something like a felt presence? And here we can draw on research that's being conducted in Parkinson's and dementia with Lewy bodies, including, again, some work conducted not very far from here. So there'll be a number of you in this room who work with people with Parkinson's who know much more about this topic than I would. And I'm assuming we'll have come across people who describe some of these experiences from time to time. They've been noted for a while as part of the minor hallucinations within Parkinsonian disorders, along with things like passage hallucinations, the feeling that the sensation that things are just passing by kind of out of the corner of your eye very quickly. Some studies, like Wood and colleagues' study in 2015, estimate really quite high prevalences for these experiences in Parkinson's. In that particular study, it was a rate of 25% in people with Parkinson's having this feeling of presence. And one of the interesting contrasts here, particularly in relation to psychotic disorders, is the sense in which the presences of Parkinson's seem a lot more affectively neutral. It's not always clear who the presence is, or that they're here with a particular intent. They might only be here fleetingly, and they don't necessarily induce all those intense emotions like fear. They might be a bit unsettling or weird, and some people do get anxious about them because they feel like it's a sign that they're becoming more ill, and it probably is. But the presence itself is almost a bit like a kind of mannequin that just happens to be there occasionally. And some of this was captured in really nice phenomenological work led by Jennifer Foley, who's based at Queen's Square, who specialises in Parkinson's. Other places in which it's as nicely captured is, for example, Frank Ormsby, the poet, his collection, The Parkinson's Poems, some of you may have come across before. He's got a series of different poems within there that talk about hallucinations and side effects, and talks about these kind of strange, like unknown figures that seem to accompany him, and he wonders kind of who they are. Okay, so there's this sense in which you can have these just pure hallucinations of figures in some way occurring in Parkinson's, also occurring in particular places like spaces of homes upstairs, kind of in the other room, which is the sort of thing we see in phantom border syndrome. Now, more recently, a kind of model for what's happening, at least there in Parkinson's, has come from work on results of brain injury and stroke producing hallucinatory phenomena, and experimental inductions of presence phenomena. And the person who's really led on this work is Olaf Blanke, based in Geneva. His team developed in 2014 a robot process to induce certain types of sensory motor hallucinations. Very briefly, the way you do this is you're sat on a stool, you have to press button, imagine you're kind of pressing a keypad out in front of you, and your hand's in a kind of handset, and you're just pressing randomly. At the same time, a robot will be touching your back in exactly the same sequence. And after a while, provided these things happen in sync, you'll start to feel like you're touching your own back. It's a very kind of classic example of a kind of full body illusion. Now, the tricky thing is what happens then if you start to make these things out of sync. Okay, having adopted that into your own kind of body schema, if you then disrupt it, suddenly people get a real jolt, and they feel like somebody's there right behind them, somebody else is doing these kind of these movements. And Blanke and colleagues argued in 2014, this is the basis or a basis of a kind of felt presence experience, that what you're doing is disrupting kind of sensory motor expectations in a very literal way. They've built on that to identify what they term a presence network in the brain. That was led by Olaf's postdoc, Fosco Bernasconi. And they developed some nice kind of new paradigms where it relies less on self-report of, oh, I feel like there's a presence, and includes some more things like numerosity judgments. They have a nice task you do in VR where very fleetingly you get glimpses of how many people there might be in a room, and you hear how many there are. Then you do this procedure where you get induced to feel like there's another presence in the room, and you see a very quick flash of how many people are in the room again. You have to make a snap judgment of how many people are there. It's very hard to kind of game it or to guess. It's just a kind of gut feeling how many are there. And basically, people who have this induced presence experiences consistently overestimate the number of people in the room as well. That was a study led by Louis Albert. Now, we might take this and think, okay, well, here we've got a model, right? We've got this sense of actually disruptions to sensory motor experience, essentially that what we could term the bodily self or bodily self-consciousness can create this feeling of presence. It would fit with perhaps some of the examples in Parkinson's, and it indeed would fit with some perhaps older theories about psychosis and schizophrenia that are very much rooted in sensory motor dysfunction. Some people even took this to be kind of so certain that you get like, these sorts of headlines in New Scientist, ever felt a ghostly presence? Now we know why. There we are. Let's just stop doing the research. We're finished. I went to Geneva in 2022 and had a go on the presence robot. It didn't work for me, but then I'm also the least hallucination-prone person in the world. Nothing interesting has ever happened to me, really. So I'm not the best test subject. But it only works for some people. It works very well in Parkinson's, particularly if you have presence experiences. And indeed, in that presence network, you can show that there are abnormalities in the network specifically for people with Parkinson's who have presences. So all of that comes together. But it leaves open the question of what else might we need when we think about things like psychosis, the kind of more complex examples of presences. And very briefly now, I'm going to touch on survival and sleep as ways of kind of hinting at the directions we need to go next. So perhaps some of the most famous presences come from survival situations. And perhaps the most famous of all is the experiences that Ernest Shackleton had when crossing South Georgia Island in May 1916 at the end of the Endurance expedition, or the Imperial Transantarctic expedition. Himself, Tom Crean and Frank Worsley were the three remaining crew who had to cross the island to save the rest of the kind of doomed Endurance crew who'd been trying to reach the South Pole since August 1914 at the outbreak of World War I. They never reached there. They got stuck in the ice of the Weddell Sea. At one point, they lived on the ice for 9 months before the boat got crushed. And then they had to make an escape for it via a series of open boats. Most of the crew got stuck on Elephant Island, and then 6 remaining men travelled 800 nautical miles to get to South Georgia Island on a tiny boat, given the size of the ocean. To finally get to safety at the whaling station at Stromness, these 3 men had to conduct a 36-hour trek across mountainous terrain that, as far as we know, nobody had ever crossed before. They didn't have any equipment to be able to do this, and somehow they managed it. And the uncanny thing is, all of them felt this experience that another traveller was with them in that trek. So this is Frank Worsley's description up here, while writing this 7 years after almost each step of that journey comes back clearly. Even now I find myself counting our party, Shackleton, Crean and I, and who was the other? Of course there were only 3, but it's strange that in mentally reviewing the crossing, we should always think of a 4th and then correct ourselves. Now, writing in 1922, T.S. Eliot, in publishing his poem The Wasteland, took this idea and turned it into a 3rd man that walked beside you, knowing of Shackleton's experiences. And it was this 3rd man that then became the basis for this kind of legend or story, particularly in the context of endurance and survival, captured really well in John Geiger's 2008 book, The 3rd Man Factor. Now, Geiger, along with Peter Sudfeld, who works on these sorts of survival situations, has argued that in these contexts, presences occur fundamentally as a defense mechanism. They provide safety. They allow people to get through adversity to get to the other side. And certainly the way that Shackleton, Crean and Worsley talked about these experiences when they did talk about them is as if something fundamentally had come and saved them. The problem with that sort of account, if we're thinking kind of empirically and theoretically, is it involves literal survivor bias, right? We hear about lots of examples of presences for the people who get back down the mountain. We don't hear about the presences that scares you so much you fall off the mountain. So we need to kind of drill down into, how powerful is this kind of legend or idea that these sorts of experiences are kind of functional in this way. Often they're kind of a bit more ambiguous and confusing when they occur. And when you look back at Shackleton's accounts, actually, there's lots of nuance in there where he is thinking about these sorts of hallucinatory experiences all through the expedition. I'd really encourage you to read South, his memoir that covers that time. And along with, Shackleton is known as a leader, as an aspiring poet. He was actually a brilliant psychologist. If you read this text, you can see how many times he's thinking through how his men are reacting to the environment, how the mind is responding to the environment. He writes about pareidolia, he writes about kind of imagined consequences. Here he's writing about the tendency to start hallucinating in these contexts too, and how people back home just have no idea of what it's really like. At one point he talks about an iceberg rearing up above them with water pouring out of holes as if it was an icy Cerberus crying at kind of their escape. So he was really on it, and there's a strong suggestion that actually they were having quite unusual experiences all along. But when you come to accounts of the 3rd man, that's where he dries up. There's a sense in which Shackleton felt like he couldn't talk about this experience. There were certain things which never can be spoken of that were beyond mortal ken. And the other 2 men were the same. Tom Crean reportedly only ever talked about it once. And if you look at Worsley and Shackleton's accounts combined, they amount to about 8 to 10 lines across 2 books, okay? So there's a real sense that we're dealing with something quite meagre. Now, for my book, for Presence, I need to do I couldn't go back and interview these men, clearly. But what I could do is interview this chap, Luke Robertson. In fact, Luke is married to a university friend of mine, and it's possibly the reason the whole book exists, because I was stood in their garden in 2020, and Luke said, "Oh, Ben, do you still work on hallucinations?" And I went, "Oh, yeah, I do." And he said, "Yeah, I had those, like Shackleton, at the South Pole." And so it's one of those moments you think, hang on, let me just get a pen. So I interviewed Luke about his experiences, and Luke, if you don't know his story, is absolutely extraordinary. He was the youngest Scot to ski to the South Pole solo. He did it when he was age 25, and before he'd done that, he had serious, significant heart surgery because he turned out he had a congenital heart defect that he only discovered when he was about 20. When he was training to go to the South Pole, he then developed serious kind of neurological issues, which they thought were indicative of a brain tumour that would need to be removed. It turned out to be a benign cyst about the size of a kind of cricket ball just behind his right eye. He never had any other kind of, thinking about some of the talks we've heard about today, he never had any other real kind of lasting symptoms of that experience other than things like migraine around the time prior to the removal. And yet he still goes to the South Pole. He goes on this trek to over 40 days reach the South Pole. The interesting thing about Luke is that he was ready for some of the hallucinations. He knew that these things happen. So he starts to see the green grass of home. He's from northeast Scotland, and he kind of knows, all right, it's my mind playing tricks on me. He starts to kind of hear the Flintstones theme tune now and again. He kind of sees the Flintstones character on the horizon at one point. He's like, no, I kind of know this is the kind of thing that happens. And then some of his batteries go wrong and he can't listen to music anymore. So he's alone and he's silent on this trek. And he also starts sleeping less because he's falling behind, and so he's trying to push himself. And things start to slowly unravel. First of all, occasionally he thinks he hears somebody calling his name. And he has this intense feeling that there's a presence behind him. And every time he has this feeling, he has to turn around and look over his shoulder, because he's convinced that if he doesn't, the presence will catch him up, tap him on the shoulder, and his heart will stop. So he's being chased by a presence. And then at 2 points later on his trek as well, he almost dies. At 2 points, he almost falls asleep. In both times, he suddenly has a feeling that a voice tells him to get up. And from that point, he feels like there's another figure that's leading him. And he said, it's my turn to be led. So think of it, you've got one person in the middle who is real, and two presences, these kind of ephemeral presences, either side of him, working their way to the South Pole. And Luke does eventually get there. And we talked about, well, how do you feel about these figures? It was how Luke felt about them. You might think, well, that's terrifying that he's got this kind of strange, murderous ghost chasing him across the ice. But actually, he said he felt obliged to that presence. He felt like that he needed to lead that presence on, and that he felt accountable. Now, he had done a lot of charity and fundraising to get to that position. He wanted to draw attention to things like young people needing pacemakers via this work. And he felt like he had to get to the end for everybody else. It was as if he was kind of carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. And that made me go back and look at Shackleton in more depth. Now, some of the most famous quotes when Shackleton talks about the third man are from his conversations with a journalist called Harold Begbie, who used to write for the Telegraph. They published their conversations in 1922. And there's some quotes that just get used again and again and again as a kind of standard thing that would happen. But other things which never really get talked about. And one quote really stood out for me, where Shackleton talks about the thought of the rest of his crew on Elephant Island. It might have been different if we had only ourselves to think about. You can get so tired in the snow, particularly if you're hungry, that sleep seems just the best thing life has to give. And to sleep out there is to die without any pain at all, like Keats's ideal of death. But if you're a leader, a fellow that other fellows look to, you've got to keep going. That was the thought that sailed us through the hurricane and rigged us up and down those mountains. Of course, I couldn't say all of this in the book. I couldn't give the mental side of the story. But this is the side, looking back, that interests me the most. So when we're thinking about who this other figure is, we have to be thinking about who the men are thinking about, who they're trying to save. And they did save all the crew. Not one man died on the Endurance expedition. It was an amazing feat of rescue. I won't say what happened to the dogs. But this is, when we're thinking about these presences, we're not talking about kind of anonymous experiences. We're talking about a deeply relational experience that these men are having. And we've seen these sorts of things come up again and again when we survey presence experiences in different populations, both healthy and kind of more clinical, whether it's people having spiritual experiences, and indeed when it's people having sports or endurance experiences. The kinds of emotions and relations people have to presences are complex. They're neither just saviours nor just scary. Sometimes they're a mixture of the two as well. And that maps onto some of the most famous case examples from neurology of having these sorts of unusual presence experiences. For example, Peter Brugger, who was a real pioneer in this line of work, published a case in 2006 of PH, who had a polyopic aortoscopy, where because of a tumour that was pushing on his posterior insular and parts of temporal parietal junction, he started to feel like he had been split in two, and then gradually felt like he had a family of presences off to his right-hand side, roughly mirroring his body position, about kind of 2 meters apart. He didn't know who they were, but he referred to them as the family and felt he had an affinity with them. And basically, for the remainder of his life, which wasn't much longer once he was in the clinic, he had about kind of 12 months, this family kept him comfort. Now, he did actually have a family. He had a real family. But this was somehow a kind of refracted sense of a family across this kind of hallucinatory experience of figures and presence, as if one had to clothe the extension of the bodily self that had somehow been disrupted by the original brain injury as well. So, turning to the last example very briefly, in sleep paralysis and hypnagogia, you have some of the most consistent examples of presence. If around kind of between a third and 1 in 7 adults have sleep paralysis, about over half of them in published studies tend to report presence experiences, and the vast majority of these are very malevolent. Perhaps some of the nastiest presence experiences occur in the context of sleep paralysis. It's also very consistent across cultures all around the world. And there are 3 main theoretical approaches to this area. One emphasizes bodily self-disruption, so somebody like V.S. Ramachandran has argued that that's the basis of presences in sleep paralysis. Another, led by Alan Chain, has argued that this is a product of our tendency to perceive threats, particularly if we are feeling prone and vulnerable, as we would in the context of sleep paralysis. But I think a more interesting hypothesis has been put forward by Tora Nielsen and Lisa Solomonova, who've argued that actually, even though you might need bodily disruption for these experiences to occur, the way that they are kind of imbued with emotion and identity comes from a sense of social imagery. And they've got some nice data showing that people who have some of these more distressing experiences also tend to be thinking a lot in their day-to-day lives about other people, particularly in kind of like anxious or slightly pathological ways. So if you've got kind of difficulties with your own social imagery during the day, you're also likely to have these kind of slightly more frightening presences in the context of sleep paralysis. Now, I could have given you many, many more examples of different kinds of presences. Essentially, there's a whole other talk which talks more about more of the imaginative and relational side of presence, even some of the presences that occur in grief and bereavement, and cover some of the things that Adam has talked about too. In brief, I would just point you towards the review I mentioned before that was led by Joe Barmby and was published in Lancet Psychiatry, where we talk about the whole family of presences that are there. But to sum up, presences, when we think about them, say in the clinic, present challenges for theory, for assessment, and for kind of understanding. And the relation to hallucinations and delusions is quite hard to disentangle. I mean, this is something people have been grappling with for over a century, but we do have data to explore this now. It seems like almost as if presence could be a marker of kind of ultimate severity, or kind of there's something additive about having presence there. There's a sense in which people are really struggling. We have a potential model in bodily self-disruption, or a disruption to sensory motor experiences, that we can draw upon things like Parkinson's to provide a sense of how is this thing possible. But there's a question about whether we also need something more. When we look at examples from, say, survival or sleep, we can start to explore the aspects of identity, emotion, and relationality that we might need, and indeed perhaps an idea of social imagery being involved in these experiences. I would say many presences are fundamentally both bodily and relational. We're probably going to need both, in particular, to understand psychotic disorders. In terms of where we go next, there's always a question of, are we lumping together different types of things here, or are we talking about a singular thing? Notably, it's actually older theories from cognitive neuropsychiatry that perhaps best explain this. You know, this idea of that it's about kind of sensory motor expectations seems to fit a bit better than some of the newer theories around predictive coding. And it's probably not very fashionable to say. We still need to know more about what the clinical significance of felt presence is in psychosis. Anecdotally, I understand from people actually that the people who are really struggling emotionally are the people who talk about these experiences more. But finally, there's also a hint that there are therapeutic opportunities. So we've done some workshops with Stanford where we've been training people who work, say, in community settings to talk about some of these experiences. And they've said that talk about presences rather than voices or visions and hallucinations is to use a term which is perceived as more neutral. It's not seen as linked to clinical phenomena. It's not seen as being stigmatizing. Now, we could say it introduces a whole load of other kind of lack of clarity. But in terms of ways in which you can engage with kind of fundamentally quite unusual experiences, it might be that presence offers opportunities there too. And I'll finish just by saying thank you to everybody for listening, and thank you to the wider Durham team and all our collaborators as well for this sort of work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was brilliant. Any questions from the audience? Sarah.
I'll put my glasses on. Hello, Sarah.
Hi. Thanks so much for a brilliant talk. I appreciate you've already given a bodily mechanism that could underlie it, but given it is such an embodied feeling state, I wonder if there's any systematic indices of such as autonomic change or other peripheral markers that track the feeling of presence.
Not yet. That work has not been done. The person who's perhaps got closest to it is Sohi Park at Vanderbilt, who's been doing lots of work on bodily perception and bodily awareness, bodily emotion in the context of psychosis and schizophrenia. But we don't yet have, there haven't been those kind of targeted hypothesis testing studies that have gone, can we track these markers specifically to that state? I think we're still in a way that the stage of kind of systematically understanding how do we assess this stuff? How do we reliably go, these people have a really distinct kind of experience? But there's lots of data out there because now people are going on, well, we need to ask about it, and it turns out there's plenty of people who are having it. So.
Thank you.
Lawrence at the back.
Hi, thanks. That was a really fascinating talk. So I was really interested in, you were talking about with Shackleton and his companions' recollections of their presence experiences and why they felt it was so hard, or they had this sensation it was so hard to talk about. Because I think in other, where I've come across it before is in sort of high altitude mountaineers in the 90s, so people like Reinhold Messner doing sort of solo, very high altitude, and who've talked very sort of freely about how they had these presences in kind of, so do you think that is kind of cultural in the sort of cultural milieu of, you know, gentlemen explorers in the early 20th century, or do you think it's in relation to the sort of, you know, a successful expedition versus a sort of unsuccessful expedition? I was just wondering if you had any thoughts.
That's a really interesting question. So, yeah, there's huge amounts of context which often get missed out from Shackleton stuff. And one thing is that everything we know about is usually from accounts they wrote down at the end of the war. So they get rescued in May 1916, and it's only then they realise the war is still going on. Because when they left civilization, everybody thought it was a 3-month war. So they immediately feel very guilty, and everybody else is relatively cross with them because they've been faffing around in the South Pole when, you know, like when, you know, the Somme happening and everything like that. So they had to really, they were quite careful about what they had license to talk about, and they were trying to convey that something deeply significant happened to them, but they had to be careful about how they did it. And Shackleton for quite a few years was perceived as a complete failure. Like Scott was the noble failure who died, and Shackleton was, all right, well, you got back, at least you got your men back. And so there was a lot of shame there and kind of things that they would struggle to talk about. But I think when we compare them to, say, any other, particularly mountaineers, people who go over kind of 6,000 feet, this sort of thing, oxygen plays a role in that too. They start to have lots of hallucinatory experiences. But they all know the Shackleton story. Like the third man legend starts from there, and people begin to expect it, and people almost think this is part of what you're doing, and they take comfort often. Frank Smythe is one of the earlier ones. He had an experience in like 1932 where he gave some Kendal Mint cake to his presence that was there with him. So you do get kind of some experiences quite soon after getting reported, but it's hard to tease apart that kind of historical aspect where actually lots of people are anticipating these experiences. I should say as well, I mean, they've been on that expedition for so long by the time they do the 36-hour trek. It really is the end of a process, and they were transformed by it, really.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, because I know that some people are trying to leave, I will just end questions there. There's some questions online as well, and I'm sorry that you've not been able to answer those questions, but maybe we can just say thank you, and we have one short presentation.